Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University School of Law, SOL. Postgraduate Diploma in Intellectual Property Rights, Pgdipr. MIP 106 Plant Varieties Protection, Biotechnology and Traditional Knowledge. Block 1 International Conventions for the Protection of New Plant Varieties. Unit 2 Plant Varieties Protection and the TRIPS Obligation. 2.1 Introduction. The issue of providing adequate incentives for innovations in plant breeding has been debated in the intellectual property community for at least 100 years. As private companies have expanded their operations in plant breeding, pressures to expand IPP in agriculture have built up globally over the past few decades. The breeding activities, which were largely carried out by the public sector, have increasingly been taken up by private seed companies. The 1980s saw an unprecedented expansion of private sector operations as major transnational corporations like Unilever, Lale, Monsanto and Rome and Haas, involved in the agrochemical industry, entered plant breeding. This was primarily because these firms aimed to offer agricultural technology as an integrated package, in which improved varieties of planting material were the critical components. Extending IPRs to plant varieties was considered as the most effective way in which plant breeders could obtain returns on their investment. The lack of fit between innovation related to plants and intellectual property regimes has been an issue of global debate. Therefore, the late inclusion in the multilateral trade negotiations under the auspices of gut of the trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, was and still remains the most contentious area and largely debated all around the world. TRIPS, which now forms an integral and important agreement of WTO, represents a significant step towards the adoption of a more globally harmonized IPR system while providing for a wider scope of protection and stronger rights for IPR owners. It also introduces into the IPR regime the obligation to provide plant breeders' rights, PBRs. While many of the developed countries had experimented with one or the other kind of IPR system for the protection for plant varieties, such laws previously never existed in most of the developing countries. In this unit, we first assess plant variety protection from an historical and comparative perspective, analyzing the emergence of the concept of breeders' rights in the developed countries. We then delineate the essential requirements under the TRIPS agreement and its impact on the changing IPR point legislations concerning plant variety protection. 2.2 Objectives. After completing the study of this unit, you should be able to times acquire a basic understanding of evolution of legislations related to PBRs. Times explain the obligations and options for plant variety protection under the TRIPS agreement. Times explain the rationale of sui generis system of PBRs, and times differentiate between the requirements of protection of plant varieties under various IPR systems. 2.3 Evolution of PARs. 2.3.1 Initial attempts. The growth of the commercial seed trade towards the end of the 19th century in several European countries witnessed the emergence of breeders' associations that played a key role in the inclusion of agricultural innovations within the international regulatory regime. Further, impetus was provided by the formation of the International Bureau of the Union for the Protection of Industrial Property in 1883, and the signing of the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property in Paris, France, on 20 March 1883. The final protocol of the Convention in Article 1(3) expanded the scope of protectable subject matter and stated, "Industrial property shall be understood in the broadest sense and shall apply not only to industry and commerce proper, but likewise to agricultural and extractive industries and to all manufactured or natural products, for example, wines, grain, tobacco leaf, fruit, cattle, minerals, mineral waters, beer, flowers, and flour. Initial efforts of providing protection for plant innovation were made by experimenting to fit them into traditional IPR systems regimes. Given the state of technology in 1883, the inclusion of these agricultural subjects within the Paris Convention was probably for the purpose of protecting trademarks and indications of source. To reward the creativity in breeding new crops more. Generic protection systems were experimented in Europe, such as concepts of seed registration and protected seals for seed from the original breeder, Germany, and monetary rewards, prizes, to breeders issued by farmers' organizations. Netherlands. 2.3.2 Tier vs. Plant Patents Act. Despite the European initiatives to establish PBRs, the first explicit inclusion of biological agricultural innovations in an IP statute was in the V.S. Plant Patents Act of 1930. This act recognized specifically that plant breeders create more than mere products of nature and exempted plant patent applications from the enabling written description required of industrial inventions under patent law. It was the first attempt in the world to legislate for the protection of new plant cultivars, provided they were both distinct and new. The statute did not define this requirement, although the Senate committee report accompanying the act stated that, in order for a new variety to be distinct, it must have characteristics clearly distinguishable from those of existing varieties, and that it was not necessary for the new variety to constitute a new species. 2.3.3 Establishment of VPOV. The Plant Patents Act gave impetus to the process of acceptance of IPR regimes for development of plant varieties. By the 1960s, some European countries enacted plant breeders' rights laws. The successful enactment of laws protecting the rights of breeders in countries such as the Netherlands and Germany, it was demonstrated that sexually reproduced varieties were uniform and stable enough to be included in these laws. In the United States, the Plant Variety Protection (PVP) Act was enacted on 24 December 1970 to encourage the development of novel varieties of sexually reproduced plants by providing exclusive marketing rights to their developers. The International Association of Plant Breeders for the Protection of Plant Varieties, ASINCEL, the acronym derived from French for Association Internationale des Sélectionneurs pour la Protection des Obtentions Végétales. V. was established in 1938 with the main objective for the adoption of an International Convention for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. The active engagement of associations of the beneficiaries of protection, mainly the International Association for the Protection of Industrial Property, EPI, and the ASINCEL lead to inspired advocacy for the creation of a new organization for the promulgation of an international legal regime for the protection of plant varieties. In 1957, the French government held a conference in Paris concerned with the protection of new varieties, in which 12 Western European countries that were known to have similar concerns on the subject were invited. The Bureaux Internationaux Réunis de la Protection de la Propriété Intellectuelle, BIRPI, which subsequently became the International Bureau of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, attended as observers. The final act, adopted on 11 May 1957, recognized the legitimacy of breeders' rights and established as the preconditions for protection that a variety had to be distinct from pre-existing varieties and sufficiently homogeneous and stable in its essential characteristics. It defined the rights of the breeder and acknowledged the principle of the independence of protection. The second session of the conference was held in Paris from 21 November to 2 December, 1961. This led to the adoption of International Convention for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants or UPOV in its French acronym, Union Internationale pour la Protection des Obtentions Végétales, which came into force in 1968. The form of intellectual property created by UPOV is known widely as Plants Breeders' Rights, PBR. The UPOV was an attempt to harmonize the legal systems for the protection of plant varieties that were enacted in Europe from the 1940s onward. The UPOV system provides protocols for assessing and describing the unique characteristics of a new variety, ensuring that it is distinct, uniform and stable. Thus, the UPOV Convention, as amended in 1972, 1978 and 1991, forms the basis of existing national laws in UPOV member states. We shall discuss the UPOV provisions in details in a separate unit. 2.4 The TRIPS Agreement. 2.4.1 TRIPS Obligations and IPR. The TRIPS Agreement, adopted in 1994 and administered by the World Trade Organization, WTO, is the first and only IPR treaty that seeks to establish universal, minimum standards of protection across the major fields of intellectual property, including patents, copyrights, trademarks, industrial designs, integrated circuits and trade secrets. Article 27 of the TRIPS Agreement defines the inventions which the member states are obliged to make eligible for patenting and what they can exclude from patenting. Inventions that can be patented include both products and processes and should generally cover all fields of technology. Among the most debated provision is Article 27.3b, see Box 1, that allows member states to exclude some kinds of inventions from patenting, i.e., plants, animals and, essentially, biological processes. However, microorganisms and non-biological and microbiological processes have to be eligible for patents. In addition, plant varieties have to be eligible for protection either through patent protection or a sui generis system, created specifically for the purpose, or a combination of the two. 2.4.2 Options for protecting plant varieties. For other fields of intellectual property, such as patents, copyrights and trademarks, the TRIPS expressly requires WTO members to comply with the standards of protection contained in pre-existing IPR agreements, such as the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works and the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Property. In sharp contrast, although TPUPOV acts have provided IPR protection for plant varieties, TRIPS agreement does not mention the same for protection of plant varieties. It is clear from Article 27.3b of TRIPS that member states are not obliged to provide for patent protection for plants and animals. However, they have to implement intellectual property protection for plant varieties. The policy options for protecting plant varieties would be as follows. Times to make provisions for the patent protection of plant varieties. Times to join the UPOV Convention. Times to provide for comparable plant variety protection, PVP, without formally joining the UPOV Convention. Times to devise a sui generis system which is better designed to suit national interests and to take into account the protection demands of informal and local communities. 2.4.3 Rationale for sui generis option. The question of sui generis intellectual property right protection for plant varieties has become the most debatable issue following the adoption of the TRIPS agreement. The concept was introduced in the negotiations as a number of countries rejected the compulsory introduction of plant patents, and there was no universal A tilde on one specific alternative to patents. The fact that the interpretation of the concept of effective sui generis system remains problematic, UPOV has advanced its system as the principal workable example of a sui generis PVP system in the debates. This has led some countries like the member states of the African Intellectual Property Organization to adopt the regime modeled after UPOV 1991 and at the same time to commit to join the UPOV Convention. The TRIPS gives member states a wide margin of appreciation in determining how to implement their obligation to introduce plant variety protection. The developing countries, while shaping their sui generis systems, are confronted with far-reaching consequences that touch upon the whole spectrum of their socio-political situation. The TRIPS makes it possible to incorporate specific exceptions and limitations in national IPR laws provisions to suit their specific needs. The major issues that have influenced the development of sui generis system in various countries are as follows. A. Conservation of genetic diversity. Concerns have been expressed regarding the consequences of according IPR to plant varieties on the plant genetic diversity. It is argued that the incentives provided by the IPRs would lead to more investments for private sector for creation of new plant varieties, thus leading to an increase in plant genetic diversity over time. A contrary view is that the spread of the commercial plant would result in the replacement of the traditional varieties and landraces under cultivation and would reduce on-farm genetic diversity by limiting the choice only to certified varieties for cultivation, which are more uniform and thus have high genetic vulnerability. B. Farmers' privileges. The concept of farmers' rights was for the first time formally recognized by the FAO Conference in 1989. The farmers' rights are in contrast to the proprietary rights of the breeders on new varieties. They are an acknowledgement of the large number of innovations and contribution made by farmers and communities for the preservation and improvement of plant genetic resources over thousands of years. Still today, there are numerous varieties called as farmers' ifocal, traditional primitive varieties or landraces that have been developed and nurtured by innovative farmers or communities who have in their acumen selected or genetically manipulated them through intervention for specific traits. These farmers' varieties or landraces have laid the foundation of all modern plant variety development programs. While the breeders can claim IPRs on the varieties, the farmers' varieties and landraces may not have the same level of genetic and phenotypic homogeneity to meet the stringent requirements of IPR protection. Protecting the farmers' varieties and rewarding farmers for their contributions to plant genetic diversity, therefore, require different approaches. Further, the farmers or communities in the developing countries mainly have decided which crops and varieties to grow and have carried over self-regenerated seeds for next season. The tradition of seed exchange with other farmers from the same or other communities always existed and resulted in enhancement and spread of the genetic diversity. Agriculture, particularly in the areas of crop diversity, therefore, developed as a dynamic system that integrated seed production, selection, storage and exchange. Even today, these farmer-based systems of seed supply have been the mainstay in many countries, and depending on the crop and country, 60 to 90% of the seed planted is farmer-produced and exchanged. Local varieties maintained by farmers occupy major part of the cropland, and diffusion of new varieties through exchange of seeds from farmer to farmer has been shown in many cases to be more effective than formal sector seed distribution. The restriction on saving seed in the IPR regimes creates a conflict that has to be resolved at the national level through appropriate exclusion of the rights of breeders in the national legislations. C. Researchers' privileges. The scope of IPRs in plant varieties has been a concern even among the breeders. The issue is utilization of legally protected varieties for developing still more new varieties. The breeder's exemption extends the scope of protection for a variety over the material of a newly developed cultivar which is derived from the original variety, as the protection is granted only for the specific variety as such, and not the breeding method, nor crop's ingredients or particular traits. Therefore, if such privileges are incorporated in the national legislations, any breeder can follow new developments without infringing the rights of the previous breeder. This freedom of operation does not permissible under a utility patent system. 2.5 Alternatives for protecting new varieties. 2.5.1 Patent system. Under the TRIPS, most member countries choose not to provide mechanisms under their national patent system in which an entity may claim that it has a legal right to intellectual property in plants and plant products. Thus, in most countries, inventions directed to plants or plant products such as seeds are not eligible for a patent grant, but some, including the United States and Australia, provide utility patents for use of plants and plant products, as long as the statutory requirement for patentability are met. While the patent legislation of each jurisdiction is different, the requirements and rights awarded to patentees are substantially similar. The issue of patenting here shall be discussed only from the limited perspective of protecting plant varieties and plant-related inventions. A. Patenting of plants in US and Australia. In the United States, the utility patent law designates 4 broad categories of patentable subject matter, composition, machines, articles of manufacture, and processes. Section 101 of Title 35 V.Sc. sets out the subject matter that can be patented. Whoever invents or discovers my new and useful process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new and useful improvement thereof may obtain a patent, therefore, subject to the conditions and requirements of this title. Plants and biological subject matter are not explicitly included. However, in 1980, the landmark Supreme Court decision of Diamond v. Chakrabarti 447 U.S. 303 and 980, see Box 2, construed Section 101 to encompass genetically modified organisms and suggested the possibility of securing utility patents on plants previously thought eligible solely for protection under the PVPA. This case undoubtedly helped to open the gates for ensuing patents for genetic engineered biological material and plant varieties. Following this analysis by the Supreme Court of the scope of 35 U.S.C. 101, the Board of Patent Appeals and Interferences has determined that plant subject matter or an animal may be protected under 35 U.S.C. 101. The first patent granted to a plant was to a corn plant which contained increased level of free tryptophan, an amino acid. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office had rejected the application on the ground that utility patent protection of plants was not available since these could be covered by the Plant Patent Act and the Plant Variety Protection Act. However, in 1985 case, known as the Ex parte Hippard 227 USPQ 443, BD, Pat. App. And Inter. 1985, the Board of Patent Appeals and Interferences held that plant subject matter may be the proper subject of a patent under 35 U.S.C. 101 even though such subject matter may be protected under the Plant Patent Act, 35 U.S.C. 161 to 164, or the Plant Variety Protection Act, 7 U.S.C. 2321 et seq. Thus, the Board of Appeals concluded that genetically engineered plant seeds and plant tissue are patentable. Box 2, Diamond v. Chakrabarti, 1980, 447 U.S. 303. Respondent Chakrabarti, a microbiologist, filed a patent application for a Human-made genetically engineered bacterium that is capable of breaking down crude oil, which makes it valuable for the treatment of oil spills. Chakraborty's patent claims were: 1. Process method of producing the bacteria. 2. An inoculum comprised of a carrier material floating on water. 3. The bacteria itself. The patent examiner allowed the first two claims but rejected the third on the basis that 1. Microorganisms are products of nature, and 2. That as living things they are not patentable subject matter under 35 V.S.C. 10L. The Court of Customs and Patent Appeal reversed and awarded the patent. The Supreme Court affirmed the decision, holding that Chakraborty's microorganism is not a nature's handiwork but a product of human ingenuity, having a distinct name, character and use, and hence patentable under 35 V.S.C. 101. The Supreme Court felt that genetically engineered organisms fall within the definition of manufactured. Chakraborty's claim is not a hitherto unknown natural phenomenon, but to a non-naturally occurring manufacture or composition of matter. Further, in the 2001 decision of J.E.M. AG Supply, Incorporated vs. Pioneer Hybrid International, INC, 534 U.S. 124, 2001, Box 3, the court conclusively held that sexually reproduced plants that are eligible for protection under the PVPA are also eligible for utility patents. As a result, plants are patentable subject matter 35 V.S.C. 101 in the U.S. In Australia, the Patent Act, 1990, allows all technologies to be patented except human beings and the biological processes for their production, provided that there is an invention, defined as an innovative idea which provides a practical solution to a technological problem. In accordance the Patents Act 1990, CTH, patent to be granted in respect of a plant should meet the general patentability criteria. Firstly, the invention must involve the intervention of a technologist applying their inventive ingenuity to produce something distinguishable from the natural source material. Secondly, the plant variety, plant components, or plant materials must be new and novel when compared to what has been publicly available prior to the date of application. Lastly, the invention must be non-obvious to a person skilled in the art. This requirement has resulted in many new plant varieties failing to meet the patentability criteria, particularly when traditional and well-known breeding methods have been employed to develop the new plant. Box 3, J.E.M. AG Supply, Incorporated vs. Pioneer Hybrid. Pioneer Hybrid filed a patent infringement suit against 1.em. Agricultural Supply, JAME. They were accused of infringing one or more of Pioneer's patents by making, using, selling, or offering to sell plaintiffs' patented seed corn products. Defendants were not authorized Pioneer sales representatives and did not claim to have any contract with Pioneer to sell Pioneer's products. However, Farm Advantage purchased patented hybrid seeds from Pioneer and resold them. Defendants never repackaged or altered Pioneer's seed containers prior to reselling the seed to customers. The defendants argued denying Pioneer's allegations and asserted, among other defenses, patent invalidity. Additionally, defendants counterclaimed, asking the court for a judgment declaring all of Pioneer's patents in suit until the allied. In their counterclaim, defendants asserted, inter alia, that sexually reproduced plants, such as plaintiff's patent in suit, were not patentable subject matter under Section 101 of the 1952 Patent Act. Defendants claimed that the United States Patent and Trademark Office granted Pioneer's patents on the basis of an erroneous understanding of applicable law. On December 10, 2001, the US Supreme Court held that utility patents may be issued for plants under 35 U.S.C. 101 despite distinct protections available under the Plant Variety Protection Act and the Plant Patent Act. Affirming the Federal Circuit's ruling by a majority vote, Justice Clarence Thomas explained that the broad scope of Section 101 was established in Diamond v. Chakrabarti and that nothing in the PVPA or the PPA precluded granting utility patent coverage to plants. B. Patenting plant varieties in EU. As seen above in the US and Australia, individual plant varieties are patentable. In Europe, individual plant varieties per se are not patentable. However, a plant which is characterized by a particular gene, as opposed to its whole genome, is not included in the definition of a plant variety and is, therefore, patentable. I. European Patent Convention. In Europe, patenting is controlled by the European Patent Convention, EPC, signed in 1973. Therefore, in addition or as an alternative to obtaining a patent through the Patent Office, in individual European countries, patent grants in nearly all European countries can be gained by filing patent application at the European Patent Office, EPO. Article 53(b) of the EPC stipulates that plant or animal varieties or essentially biological processes for the production of plants or animals are not patentable. This article reflects the fact that some of the main countries of the EC, which are members nations of the UPOV Convention, had already stipulated a special law for the protection of new plant varieties in compliance with the provisions of the UPOV Convention. This brings up the issue of the definitional distinction between plants and plant varieties. The first consideration of this issue by the Technical Board of Appeal of the EPO occurred in 1984 in the Chiba-Gegi determination. This case is related to claims directed to propagating materials and seedlings treated with a chemical agent to confer on the plant a degree of protection from the toxic side effects of certain herbicides. The Examination Division rejected these claims on the basis that plant varieties are excluded from patentable matters in Article 53(b) of the Patent Law. However, the Technical Board of Appeals of the EPO admitted these claims. Applying the definition of plant variety in the UPOV Convention, it held that new plant varieties excluded from patentable subject matters stipulated in Article 53(b) of the Patent Law are only those new plant varieties meeting the requirements of distinctness, uniformity and stability. In this case, the claims covered merely the application of a chemical treatment and not plant varieties as such, and that Article 53(b) should not be construed to exclude a cultivated plant that has been chemically treated. This approach was applied by the Technical Board of Appeal in the hybrid plant lubrizol case, where the board held that the term plant varieties means a multiplicity of plants which are largely the same in their characteristics, i.e., homogeneity, and remain the same within specific tolerances after every propagation or every propagation cycle, i.e., stability. The board then ruled that the patent may be patentable, and that even if the invention is related to a breeding method using classic mating, the invention may still be patentable provided that the invention is characterized by a technical feature not found in nature, such as a combination of special artificial processes to realize a high yield, since such a method is not an essential biological process. 2. European Directive on Protection of Biotechnological Inventions. Since most of the biotechnological inventions are subject to possible self-replication, the impact of the concept of exhaustion of the right after the first sale had to be clarified. In order to avoid discrepancies among European member states, it was proposed in 1988 to have a directive on that important subject. After 10 years of parliamentary debates, a consensus on the protection of biotechnological inventions was reached on 6 July 1998, through the adoption of the Directive 98/44/EC of the European Parliament on the legal protection of biotechnological inventions. The directive provides the framework for protecting biotechnological inventions by the member states. The objective of the directive is to clarify the distinction between what is patentable and what is not and harmonize protection for biotechnological inventions, including plant protection, amongst the European Union members. The European Biotechnology Directive permits the patentability of Inventions. Concerning plants where the technical feasibility is not confined to a particular plant variety. Patent claims can therefore be made in respect of plant groupings. A plant grouping which is characterized by a particular gene, and not its whole genome, is not covered by the protection of new varieties and is not excluded from patentability even if it comprises new varieties of plants. Therefore, transgenic plants are patentable if they are not restricted to a specific plant variety, but represent a broader plant grouping. The European directive considers plant cells to be microbiological products and as a result patentable. This qualification was addressed by the Technical Board of Appeal in Novartis. Transgenic plant, Case G198. The original patent application by Chiba. Geigy Times. Later on Novartis, now Syngenta, in 1991 concerned a patent containing claims to transgenic plants comprising in their genome specific foreign genes, the expression of which resulted in the production of antipathologically active substances and to methods of preparing such plants. The application by was rejected by the EPO, supported by the Technical Board of Appeal on the ground that Article 53(b) denied the patentability of an invention which could embrace plant varieties. The case was subsequently handed over to the EPO's highest chamber. In its decision of 20th December 1999, the Enlarged Board of Appeal indicated that it would favor the application because, in substance, it did not involve an application for a plant variety. This determination contains some useful guidance on the legal definition of plant varieties. The Enlarged Board of Appeal noted that the definitions of plant variety in the UPOV Convention and the EC Regulation on Community Plant Variety Rights refer to the entire constitution of a plant or a set of genetic information, whereas a plant defined by a single recombinant DNA sequence is not an individual plant grouping to which an entire constitution can be attributed. It observed that the claimed transgenic plants point in the application before they were defined by certain characteristics allowed the plants to inhibit the growth of plant pathogens. No claim was made for anything resembling a plant variety. The tribunal noted that in the case of PVR an applicant had to develop a plant group, fulfilling in particular the requirements of homogeneity and stability, whereas in the case of a typical genetic engineering invention, a tool was provided whereby a desired property could be bestowed on plants by inserting a gene into the genome of a specific plant. It observed that the development of specific varieties was not necessarily the objective of inventors involved in genetic engineering. C. Standards of patentability and the rights granted. The legal criteria for patentability are substantially similar across all jurisdictions. In order to show that the plant technology or plant product of interest is an invention, the patent application must show 1. Novelty. 2. Non-obviousness, or an inventive step. 3. Usefulness, United States, or industrial applicability, Europe, Australia. 4. Enablement. 5. Claim clarity. 6. Written description. 7. Best MQDA, United States only. From the date that a patent is granted, the patent holder has the exclusive right to exploit the invention or authorize another person to do so until the patent expires. Patent rights grants the owner the right to exclude others from making, using, selling or offering for sale or importing the protected invention for a 20-year period from the earliest file date. D. Invention versus discovery. Although the patent laws of some countries use the words invention and discovery synonymously, it is a universally accepted principle that discoveries, in the strict sense of the word, are not patentable. Natural source material should not be coverable by patents as exclusionary rights in any country in the world, because natural source material is not novel. Discoveries that fall under the laws of nature, physical phenomena, and abstract ideas have been held not patentable. The case Funk Brothers Seed Co. v. Carlo Inoculant Co. 333 U.S. 127, 1948. Box 3 supports the discovery-invention dichotomy in the patentable subject matter inquiry. E. Exemptions. Exemptions to patent infringement that are relevant to patenting of plants are provided in some jurisdictions. Experimental use exception allows researchers to use patented inventions for carrying out experiments without taking the license from the patent holder. This includes both usage of patented invention as a research tool and experimenting on the patented invention to better it or otherwise. The US has an extremely narrow experimental use exception which terms any experiments for commercial purposes as patent infringement, except those for drug regulatory purposes. Box 4, Funk Brothers Seed Co. v. Carlo Inoculant Co. Leguminous plants have the ability to take nitrogen from the air and fix it in the plant for conversion to organic nitrogenous compounds. However, capability depends on the presence of bacteria of the genus Rhizobium, which infect the roots of the plant and form nodules on them. The general practice was to manufacture and sell inoculants with each package containing only one species of root nodule bacteria. The patent provided a mixed culture of rhizobia capable of simultaneously inoculating the seeds of plants belonging to several cross-inoculation groups. Carlo exploited the claimed invention by providing a mixed culture of rhizobia capable of inoculating plants belonging to several groups. The appellant Carlo brought a patent infringement suit against the respondent Funk for selling similar packages. The respondent counterclaimed alleging the patent was invalid. The Supreme Court clarified the requirements that a microorganism must meet in order to fall within the definition of patentable subject matter under 101. The court invalidated the claim on the ground that Carlo had merely discovered a natural phenomenon. The mere aggregation of species falls short of invention within the meaning of the patent statutes. The court observed that the combination of species produces no new bacteria, no change in the 6 species of bacteria, and no enlargement in their utility, and that each species had the same effect it always had. He who discovers an unknown phenomenon of nature has no claim to a monopoly. In Australia, limited exemptions are defined within the legislation. The prior use exemption allows someone who was utilizing the patented product or process before the priority date of a claim to continue using the patented product without infringement. The EU Directive Article 11, 1, and 2 provides a farmer's privilege, a particular right which limits the monopoly of a patent holder. According to this provision, when there has been a sale or any other commercialization of a plant propagating material to a farmer, the hitter is allowed to use the products of his harvest for propagating or multiplying them. This means that the farmer is allowed to keep some seeds he would have produced to sow crops in the following year. 2.5.2 Plant patents. Specific plant patents are only available in a very few countries. As mentioned above, the first Plant Patent Act was enacted by the U.S. Congress in 1930. The Act had a limited coverage and patent protection applied only to asexually propagated fruit and ornamental species, because of the view that sexually reproduced varieties lacked stability. Asexually propagated plants are those that are reproduced by means other than from seeds, such as by the rooting of cuttings, by layering, budding, grafting, enarching, etc. The Act, however, excluded tuber-propagated plants principally for political rather than technical reasons. The concern was that this would lead to monopolies in basic foodstuffs such as potatoes. This concern was reflected in the position of developing countries like India in explicitly excluding from patenting agriculture products. I. The Act was subsequently amended to exclude plants found in an uncultivated state, i.e., wild plants. It has also been determined through case law that the term plant is defined by its lay rather than its scientific meaning, and hence, bacteria are excluded, while the patentability requirements are same as those for utility patents. The implementation of these requirements is less stringent. For example, the disclosure requirement for a plant patent would not be so demanding as to prevent protection, as per 35 U.S.C. 162. No plant patent shall be declared invalid for non-compliance with the disclosure requirement for utility patents, if the description is as complete as is reasonably possible. It does, however, require that the new variety be described as complete as reasonably possible. Plant patents confer on the owner the right to exclude others from asexually reproducing the plant and from using, offering for sale, or selling the plant so reproduced, or any of its parts, throughout the United States, or fro importing the plant so reproduced, or any parts thereof, into the United States. 35 U.S.C. 163. The rights are granted for a period of 20 years. In contrast to utility patents, plant patents cover a single new plant and its asexually reproduced offspring only, and the protection conferred is quite limited, as plant patents are granted on the entire plant. It follows that only one claim per plant patent is permitted. The Plant Patent Act was amended on 27 October 1998 to extend the exclusive right to plant parts obtained from protected varieties, but it is not applied retroactively. It is possible to obtain protection for the same plant both as a utility patent and a plant patent in the United States at the same time, provided that the requirements for patentability for both types of patents are fulfilled. 2.5.3 Plant breeders' rights and OPOV. The term plant breeders' rights is synonymously used with plant variety rights. The PBR, like other IPRs, allows the plant variety owner to prohibit specific unauthorized uses of the variety. As the PBR laws apply only to plants, they are considered as a class of sui generis systems. PBR systems, like other IP systems, have three major components. 1. Definition identification of protectable subject matter. 2. Requirements that must be met to receive protection. 3. Rights of the variety owner. PBRs, like patents and other forms of IP laws, are forms of national legislation. The signatories of WTO are committed to comply with the requirements of a harmonized minimum level of IP rights protection for plant varieties. The OPOV Act adopts most of the international IPR obligations, including a definition of the applicable subject matter and protected material, eligibility requirements, exclusive rights, national treatment, reciprocity, terms of protection, and exceptions and limitations to exclusive rights. The OPOV is an international agreement that provides a framework under which countries can implement a protection system that generally fulfills the TRIPS requirement. Though a treaty, countries are not obliged to join OLOV and membership is purely voluntary. However, many countries have joined OPOV and modeled their PBR legislations as per its framework. Details about the OPOV Convention and requirements for obtaining PBR are discussed in a separate unit. While it is beyond the scope to discuss individual legislations on PBR available in different countries, few cases are discussed below as examples. 2.5.4 Plant Variety Protection Certificates, United States. As seen above, in the United States plant varieties can be protected by patents, and thus it is not technically obliged by the TRIPS agreement to have additional protection for plant varieties. However, the US is also a OPOV member and implements the UPOV Convention by the Plant Variety Protection Act, 1970. Changes to the Act made by amendments in 1994 to comply with the 1991 UPOV Convention. The Plant Variety Protection Act is administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which issues Plant Variety Protection Certificates, PVPC, for qualifying plant varieties. The Act protects sexually reproduced plants, including first-generation, F1, hybrids and tuber-propagated plants, e.g. potato varieties. The requirements and term of this protection offered are exactly the same as those outlined in the UPOV Convention. It is obligatory to deposit seeds of the new variety with an authorized depository, and in the case of F1 hybrids, seeds of the parents must also be deposited. There is a limited farmers' exemption, and the protected seed may be saved for replanting on their own individual holdings, provided that it is not sold to any third parties who use it for reproductive purposes. Simultaneous protection both as a utility patent and APVPC is also permitted. The choice usually depends on the level of protection sought and the ability to satisfy the necessary requirements. Patent system is preferred in cases where comprehensive exclusive rights are desired. 2.5.5 Community Plant Variety Rights, European Union. The Community Plant Variety Right, CPVR, is a form of intellectual property for the protection of plant variety rights created by EU legislation, Regulation 2100/94/EC, in 1995. The CPVR system is managed by the Community Plant Variety Office, CPVO, established to run the regime on granting plant variety right protection valid throughout the EU. Thus, the CPVR enables applicants, on the basis of one application, to be granted as a single IPR which is operative throughout all countries that are members of the EU. A CPVR can only be transferred or seized within the EU community on a uniform basis. That is, a CPVR can only be valid or cancelled across all EU countries, not selected individual countries. The CPVR system offers the member countries an alternative form of protection alongside the national plant protection legislation. However, protection for the same variety cannot be held under both the CPVR and the national system at the same time. In case a CPVR is granted in relation to a variety for which a national right has already been granted, the national right is suspended for the duration of the CPVR. 2.5. 6 Regulations on the protection of new varieties of plants. People's Republic of China. The regulations on the protection of new varieties of plants of China is a UPOV-based system. It provides for rights in new varieties of plants, which are defined as a cultivated plant variety or a developed one based on a discovered wild plant, which is new, distinct, uniform and stable, and whose denomination is adequately designated. Article 24 of the Patent Act of the PRC explicitly rules out the grant of patents for animal and plant varieties. 2.5.7 Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Right Act, India. India became a member of the World Trade Organization on 1 January 1995. As a member, India was then required to comply with the TRIPS agreement. Specifically, Article 27.3(b), and enact legislation to protect plant varieties either by patents or by an effective sui generis system. India adopted the sui generis approach and legislated the protection of plant varieties and farmers' right, PPVFR, Act 2001. The sui generis option for the protection of plant varieties had three major advantages: A. Flexibility, B. Better protection of farmers' rights, and C. Stronger researchers' exemptions meeting the social, ethical and cultural value of Indian ethos. The Act has been developed by integrating the rights of breeders, farmers and communities, and taking care of the concerns for equitable sharing of benefits. The PPVFR Act has been envisaged with the objective to stimulate the much-needed investment by the private sector in agriculture research and development, recognize and protect the rights of farmers in respect of their contribution in conserving, improving, and making available plant genetic resources for development of new varieties. The details of the provisions shall be discussed in detail in other unit. 2.6 Review of Article 27.3b. The Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, was adopted in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The objectives of this convention are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. The details of the CBD shall be discussed in a separate unit. It may, however, be mentioned that the TRIPS agreement is creating serious challenges to the successful implementation of the CBD, including in relation to access and benefit sharing, protection of traditional knowledge, technology transfer, and the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. The relationship between TRIPS and CBD has given rise to many issues, and many policymakers and members of civil society are concerned that the TRIPS agreement promotes private commercial interests at the expense of other important public policy objectives as contained in the CBD. As given in the box 1 above, the TRIPS agreement requires a review of Article 27.3b. The article specifically deals with the issues of patentability of plant and animal inventions and protection of new plant varieties. However, paragraph 19 of the 2001 Doha Declaration has provided additional focus on these issues, and the TRIPS Council is to look into the relationship between the TRIPS agreement and CBD and on the issue of protection of traditional knowledge and folklore. Most recently discussed are the proposals on disclosing the source of biological material and associated traditional knowledge in patent applications. Till date, the issue is under discussion, and as expected, the members' views continue to be divergent on the practical and operational context of the existing patent mechanisms for disclosing the origins of genetic material and any associated traditional knowledge used in inventions. 2.7 Summary. Times providing plant breeders' rights, PBRs, as incentive for innovations in plant breeding has been a global concern, particularly with the expansion of operations by private companies in this sector. Initial efforts for providing PBR were made exploring the option of fitting them into traditional patent regimes. The first attempt was made in US through the U.S. Plant Patents Act of 1930. Times by the 1960s, many European countries had enacted PBR laws, which led to the adoption of International Convention for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, UPOV, 1968 and amended in 1972, 1978 and 1991. It forms the basis of existing national laws in UPOV member states. Times pressures to expand IPR to plant varieties were witnessed during the TRIPS negotiations. TRIPS Article 27.3b obliges member states to provide PBRs, either through patent protection or a sui generis system or a combination of the two. The options makes it possible for member states to incorporate specific exceptions and limitations in national PBR laws by incorporating concerns inter alia for conservation of genetic diversity, farmers' privileges, and researchers' privileges, suiting their specific socio-political situation. The TRIPS agreement also requires a review of Article 27.3b. In most countries, inventions directed to plants or plant products such as seeds are not eligible for a patent grant, but some, including the United States and Australia, provide utility patents provided the statutory requirement for patentability are met. In Europe, individual plant varieties per se are not patentable. However, a plant which is characterized by a particular gene is not included in the definition of a plant variety and is, therefore, patentable. Times in addition to patents in the US, the Plant Variety Protection Act issues plant variety protection certificates, PVPC, for granting PBRs based on the UPOV 1991 Convention. In Europe, the Community Plant Variety Right, CPVR system grants plant variety right valid throughout the EU. While TRIPS agreement does not mention the UPOV acts, the same have been advanced as the principal workable example of an effective sui generis PVP system. And many countries have modeled their legislations after UPOV 1991 and or have joined the UPOV Convention. Times adopting the sui generis approach, India has legislated the Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Right, PPVFR, Act 2001. The Act integrates the rights of breeders, farmers and communities, and incorporating concerns for equitable sharing of benefits. Thank you for listening. We will be back with the next chapter.